When my mom died, she made one simple request: to have her ashes scattered in the field where she spent her life teaching children. But my uncle had other plans. He showed up at the funeral, red-eyed and reeking of whiskey, and took her ashes without saying a word. He said he was doing what's right for the family, but when I followed him to the cemetery, I realized he wasn't just ignoring my mother's wishes, he was hiding something far worse. If you've ever had to fight for someone you loved, even after they were gone, this story is for you. Rachel didn't just stand up for her mother's final wish, she made sure it was heard. If this moves you, like, comment, or subscribe to hear more stories like hers. My name is Rachel Moore. I'm 38 years old, and I work as a social worker in a small town in Wisconsin. People come to me when they've hit rock bottom: addiction, abuse, grief. I listen, I help, I fight for them when they can't fight for themselves. But I never imagined I'd have to fight for my own mother after she passed away. Her name was Margaret Moore, a lifelong teacher, beloved by everyone who ever sat in her classroom. She taught second grade for nearly 30 years, and every student she touched left a little more curious, a little more kind. She believed in people, especially the broken ones. Maybe that's why I became a social worker. She taught me that healing wasn't just possible, it was sacred. When she got sick, it happened fast. Pancreatic cancer, 6 months from diagnosis to goodbye. In those last weeks, we talked a lot about memories, regrets, and the things that truly mattered. She was clear about one thing: she didn't want to be buried. "I want my ashes scattered in that wildflower field behind Forest Lake Elementary," she whispered one night, her voice like paper. "It's where I became who I am." I promised I would do it. No headstone, no plot, just the wind, the grass, and the open sky. She smiled, and that smile stayed with me even after she slipped away. We held a quiet memorial at our family home. Friends, neighbors, former students, even a few of her old teaching assistants came to pay their respects. People shared stories, cried, laughed, and hugged. It was beautiful, simple, just like she would have wanted. But then Uncle Dennis showed up. He hadn't called once during her illness. No hospital visits, no texts, nothing. But there he was, red-eyed, stumbling a little, clearly drunk even in the morning light, holding a cheap bouquet of gas station roses. Dennis was Mom's younger brother, in his early 60s, graying fast, with a voice that always seemed just short of a shout. He used to be a mechanic, but alcohol and bitterness had taken over his life long ago. He lived alone in a trailer on the outskirts of town and hadn't spoken to Mom in nearly 2 years. They'd fought about family money, about politics, about the fact that Mom refused to be buried in the Moore family plot. He said it was a slap in the face to tradition. She said it was her life, her death, her choice. So when Dennis walked into the memorial and headed straight for the table where the urn sat, I tensed. He looked at the urn, then at me. "She should be buried next to our parents," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's where she belongs." I stepped in front of him. Mom didn't want that. She told me, she told all of us, what she wanted. But he just smiled this smug, sad smile and said, "Well, sometimes the family knows better than the dead." Then, before I could stop him, he picked up the urn and walked out. Just like that. For a second, I was frozen. The whole room was silent, like the air had been sucked out. I should have run after him, but my legs wouldn't move. My aunt cried out. Someone whispered my name, but I didn't hear any of it. All I could see was the back of Dennis's pickup truck disappearing down the driveway. I called him that night. He didn't answer. I texted. Nothing. The next day I drove out to his trailer. His truck was there, but he wouldn't come to the door. I left a note. I left flowers. I even begged. Days passed, then a week. People started to move on. They assumed he'd come around eventually, that he was just grieving in his own way. But I knew better. This wasn't grief. This was control. Dennis had always been about power, about taking what he thought was his, no matter who it hurt. And now, somehow, he thought my mother's ashes were his to decide over. That's when something shifted in me. All my years as a social worker had taught me how to speak softly, to mediate, to de-escalate. But this wasn't a case. This was personal. And I was done playing nice. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's urn in Dennis's calloused hands, being dragged out the front door like it was a sack of garbage. And every morning I woke up thinking maybe he'd come to his senses. He didn't. Instead, word got around. Small towns are like that. People started whispering that Dennis was planning to bury Mom in the Moore family plot. Not as a tribute, not out of love, but because he wanted control, the last word, the final say. He hadn't just stolen her ashes, he was about to rewrite her story, and I couldn't let that happen. I drove out to the family cemetery, a dusty corner of an old hillside where generations of Moores had been buried. It was private land, overgrown and forgotten, except when someone died. I parked far off, where he wouldn't see me, and walked along the fence line under the July sun. And sure enough, tucked behind the brush, I found fresh tire tracks, wide and deep, like someone had backed in something heavy. Near the old stone markers, a shallow rectangle had been cleared. A patch of ground dug up, then covered again. Not fully buried, just disturbed. I crouched down, heart pounding, and touched the earth. It was still loose. But I didn't find the urn. He wasn't finished yet. I needed to know what he was doing, when he was doing it, and why. I wasn't just Rachel the daughter anymore. I was Rachel the investigator. That's when I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Angela Ruiz. She used to be a private investigator before moving into court records and legal research. We'd worked together on a few domestic abuse cases. She was sharp, discreet, and didn't ask dumb questions like, "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" I gave her everything I had, texts, the dates, even photos of the disturbed soil. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and said, "You want me to follow your drunk uncle around to catch him illegally burying human remains?" "Yes," I said. "I want to catch him in the act." She didn't even blink. Done. For the next week, Angela shadowed him. She rented a beat-up old car so he wouldn't recognize her. She watched him go into funeral homes, hardware stores, even an old church where our great-grandfather used to preach. He was asking about permits, looking for a way to make it all look official. That's when I realized he wasn't just stubborn, he was dangerous. He was going to bury my mom without consent, without a death certificate for burial, without even the decency to tell me when. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a violation. Angela caught photos of him meeting with a local groundskeeper. They stood by his truck, pointing at a plastic container in the back covered with a blanket. She got a clear shot. And later, when he handed the man a folded envelope, we had it all on camera. But it still wasn't enough to stop him. You see, in Wisconsin, the laws around ashes are murky. Families can dispute burial sites, but law enforcement tends to stay out of it unless something egregious happens. I called the local sheriff's office. They told me, "Unless there's proof he's breaking the law, our hands are tied." "Proof?" I said. "He stole a human being." I felt helpless again, small, like that scared little girl who used to hide under the kitchen table during their fights. But then something clicked. I didn't need to wait for permission. I needed to make this public. So I called up Amanda Langley, a local reporter who'd covered several abuse and elder care cases I'd worked on. She remembered me. I told her the story, every last detail. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Can I meet you at the field? The one your mom loved?" We met the next morning. I showed her the lesson plans my mom had written under that same tree. The class photo from 1996, with the wildflowers blooming behind them. I told her about the promise I'd made, about the urn, about Dennis, about everything. And Amanda cried. That afternoon, she published a piece titled, "A Daughter's Promise: Why One Woman is Fighting for Her Mother's Final Wish." The article went viral, well, viral for a small town. Comments flooded in. Former students shared how Mom had changed their lives. Parents wrote about how she helped their children learn to read. One woman said she still had a note my mom had written her son, 20 years ago. And buried in the flood of love were the questions, who would steal someone's ashes? What kind of man does that to his sister? How can this be legal? The town turned on Dennis. Even the local church, the same one he tried to involve, pulled away. The groundskeeper refused to continue. People started watching him when he went out. He called me that night, drunk, slurring, furious. "You think you're better than me? You think Mom didn't want tradition? She was confused. She didn't mean all that." I said nothing, just breathed. He went on. "You always were her little soldier, always cleaning up after her. Well, now you've got the whole damn town turned against me." And then he said it. "But it doesn't matter. You can't stop what's already been set in motion." He hung up. I sat there for a long time staring at the phone. I didn't know what he meant exactly, but I knew one thing. It wasn't over. Not yet. Dennis's drunken voicemail played over and over in my mind like a warning bell. You can't stop what's already been set in motion. I knew he was planning something permanent. He wanted to bury Mom, legally or not, and make sure no one, not even me, could undo it. But I also knew something he didn't. I wasn't alone anymore. By now, Amanda's article had reached not only local hearts, but also alumni groups, teacher networks, even state education forums. A Facebook group started by one of my mom's former students exploded with posts. They were calling it #ScatterForMargaret. Teachers and parents were uploading pictures from her classroom, sharing memories, offering support. Some even volunteered to speak out publicly if needed. Dennis had always counted on silence, but now eyes were watching him. Still, that didn't mean I could sit back. If I wanted to stop him before he buried her, I needed to move faster than he could dig. Angela and I came up with a plan. We weren't just going to expose what he'd done. We were going to make it legally impossible for him to finish what he started. The first step? Secure legal authority over Mom's remains. See, technically, I was the next of kin, and I had written documentation of her final wishes. But Dennis was arguing that, as her only living sibling, he had the right to family tradition burial, whatever that meant. It was a gray area. But there was one thing I had that he didn't: Mom's handwritten letter. She'd written it 3 weeks before she died. It wasn't notarized, but it was dated, signed, and in her own handwriting. It said plainly, "Rachel, when the time comes, please scatter my ashes behind Forest Lake Elementary. That's my true resting place. I don't want to be buried. I want to be free." Angela took the letter and filed for an emergency restraining order with the probate court, citing unlawful possession of remains and imminent unauthorized interment. The judge granted us a temporary injunction. Dennis was officially prohibited from burying Mom, or doing anything with her ashes, until a full hearing. But that still didn't get the urn back. So we moved to step 2, force his hand. Angela advised me to serve Dennis with a notice of the injunction publicly, right at the trailer where he was hiding, but I had a better idea. I reached out to Amanda, the reporter, again. I asked her if she'd be willing to cover the service of papers, on camera. At first she hesitated. "You want me to turn this into a scene?" I said, "No. I want people to see that some battles aren't just legal, they're moral. He's not grieving, he's stealing." She agreed. That Saturday, I drove out with Angela and a uniformed process server. Amanda and her cameraman followed at a distance. When we arrived, Dennis came out onto his porch holding a beer and a scowl. "What the hell is this?" he barked. The process server handed him the envelope. "Mr. Dennis Moore, you are hereby served an injunction prohibiting any handling, burial, or distribution of Margaret Moore's remains." He laughed. "You think this'll stop me? You can't erase family." I stepped forward. "I'm not trying to erase family, Dennis. I'm trying to honor Mom. You're the one disrespecting her." He took a swig of his beer, muttered something about damn liberals, and went back inside, slamming the door. But the camera caught all of it. His arrogance, his intoxication, his utter lack of remorse. The clip aired that night on the local station. Within hours, the Facebook group tripled in size. Former students wrote letters to the editor. A state representative from our district reposted the story with the caption, "Every Wisconsin family deserves the right to carry out their loved one's final wishes." Momentum was building. But I knew Dennis wouldn't stop unless he was cornered. That led us to step 3, find out where he was keeping the urn. Angela managed to access drone footage from a neighbor who lived behind his property. The footage showed Dennis carrying a dark container from his trailer into an old, rusted-out shed. The door had a padlock, but the roof was partially collapsed. "He's stashing it there," Angela said. "He's waiting for the dust to settle." We called the sheriff again, but they still wouldn't act without a full court order. So we made a choice. We weren't going to wait. The next morning, Angela and I stood just outside the old shed on Dennis's property. We hadn't broken in. We hadn't even touched the lock. But we had cameras mounted just beyond the tree line, and the drone had confirmed what we suspected. He was moving the urn at night, trying to stay one step ahead. I didn't want to get arrested. I wanted justice. So instead of cutting the lock, we filed for a court-ordered property inspection, citing the probable presence of unlawfully held human remains. Angela knew exactly which channels to push. It bought us time, but more importantly, it kept Dennis stuck in a corner. And while the courts churned, we turned up the heat in a different way. Amanda ran a follow-up story, this time with witness statements. A retired school janitor testified that my mom had spoken often about her final wish, how she'd walk that wildflower field during recess just to hear the children's laughter one last time. A former student, now a firefighter, shared that she'd called him the day before she passed, asking if he remembered the oak tree behind the playground. These weren't just testimonials. They were evidence of intention. The narrative was clear now. Margaret Moore wanted peace, Dennis Moore wanted power, and people were starting to choose sides. One afternoon, I got a call from a local florist. "Hi, are you Rachel Moore?" "Yes." "I just thought you should know. A man came in today asking about where to buy a burial marker, said it was for his sister, but he seemed agitated. He left before finishing the order." Dennis was growing desperate. The pressure was closing in, and like most bullies, he didn't know how to handle exposure. He started posting cryptic things online. Facebook rants about fake daughters and liberal lies, and how the good old days are being erased by feelings. He even accused me of forging Mom's letter, claimed it was written under duress. But that blew up in his face, because one of Mom's friends, her former teaching assistant Connie, had helped her write that very letter. She still had the original draft in her handwriting, with edits from Mom. Amanda published that too. Now even people who'd stayed quiet before, cousins, church members, former co-workers, started speaking up. Not just in defense of Mom's wishes, but about Dennis. How he'd pressured his own mother to rewrite her will. How he'd stolen a neighbor's tools and blamed a teen down the road. How he'd once shown up drunk to a funeral and made a scene. It was like a dam had broken. "And Dennis?" he snapped. "I came home one night to find a rock thrown through my kitchen window. On it, a note, barely legible in smudged ink. She was my sister, not yours to claim." I called the police, filed a report, installed cameras, But honestly, I wasn't scared. I was angry. He wasn't just trying to bury Mom, he was trying to erase me. Angela advised me to stay calm, stay legal. So I did. We filed for full custodianship of the remains through probate court, based on the overwhelming evidence of intent, the pattern of harassment, and the public threat of interference. It wasn't fast, but it was moving. The judge scheduled a hearing within the week, and in the meantime, something unexpected happened. Forest Lake Elementary, the school where Mom taught, invited me to speak at their end-of-summer gathering. Dozens of her old students were attending. They'd planted a memorial garden behind the school, right near the oak tree she loved so much. They called it Margaret's Meadow. When I got there, I nearly cried. Rows of wildflowers bloomed around a small wooden bench. On it, a bronze plaque read, "For Miss Moore, who taught us how to grow." It wasn't her final resting place. Not yet. But it was a sign. The town remembered her for who she truly was. The kids she'd taught now stood with their own children, telling stories about Miss Moore's butterfly projects and her Friday science songs. She wasn't fading, she was blooming. And Dennis? He was alone. Back at his trailer, Angela's cameras caught him late one night, dragging a tarp out of the shed and pacing in circles like a man haunted. He didn't know what to do, because he was outnumbered, out-argued, and finally, out of time. The hearing was in 3 days, and whether he liked it or not, he was going to lose. Watching Dennis unravel was deeply satisfying, but Rachel's fight wasn't over yet. The courtroom was waiting, and so was the truth. If you've ever stood your ground against someone who thought they held all the power, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more true stories that echo justice. Rachel stood in front of the mirror in her small, rented apartment. Her reflection stared back. Not the woman who once felt crushed by betrayal, but someone sharper, quieter, and carved by purpose. The weight she'd carried for months was now concentrated into a single moment that was fast approaching: the court hearing for Dennis's suit. Dennis had filed to formally claim the house and lock her out of any remaining inheritance. It was a bold, reckless move, and to Rachel, it felt like the final chess piece falling into place. He thought he could force her into silence through legal intimidation, but he had no idea how ready she truly was. Her lawyer, Beth Monroe, a seasoned woman with a no-nonsense tone and eyes that missed nothing, met with her daily in the final week. "Rachel, this will get ugly," Beth warned. "He'll try to paint you as irrational, as weak. But we have everything: documents, emails, that shady wire transfer from the trust fund, and more." Rachel nodded. She'd collected it all over the months: bank statements Dennis had carelessly forwarded to her ex-stepmom, a suspiciously timed property reappraisal, and even a video recording of a heated phone call where Dennis threatened her with ruining her name if she didn't back off. She hadn't told him it was recorded. She had learned to keep her cards close. But what made Beth raise an eyebrow was what Rachel pulled out next: a printed set of emails between Dennis and a financial advisor, where he had tried, and failed, to forge Rachel's signature months earlier. He had wanted full access to their father's remaining estate under her name. That attempt alone could hold up as criminal fraud. Beth's expression changed. "He's not just greedy, he's stupid," Rachel almost smiled. Meanwhile, Dennis was unraveling in his own way. He had no idea that Rachel had retained a lawyer, let alone one as tough as Beth. He thought she was just emotional and grieving, too naive to understand estate law. He strutted into the courthouse hallways like a man already victorious, throwing around smug smiles and rehearsed charm. But under that confidence, cracks were forming. Rachel heard through a mutual friend that Dennis had recently been in a panic. He'd tried to bribe one of the estate accountants to lose some files, but the man refused and had since offered to testify. The accountant had grown uncomfortable with Dennis's tone and suspected foul play. When Rachel's legal team approached him, he agreed to cooperate, disgusted by Dennis's tactics. The night before the court date, Rachel lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the sheer gravity of what was coming. She clutched a folder of evidence to her chest, almost like armor. She wasn't just about to fight for her father's legacy. She was about to prove, to Dennis, to herself, to the court, that she was no one's victim. The next morning, Rachel dressed carefully. Dark blazer, clean lines, hair tied back, not a trace of excess. She wanted to look exactly like who she was, a woman with nothing to hide and everything to defend. Outside the courthouse, Beth gave her a firm nod. "Let's take him down." And inside, as Dennis took his seat, smirking and confident, Rachel met his eyes with a stare that did not flinch. The storm had arrived. The town hall was packed that Wednesday evening. Word had spread quickly. After all, when the mayor's wife calls for a public accountability forum, people show up. Amanda stood backstage, the documents trembling slightly in her hands, though her face remained unreadable. Her green eyes scanned the curtain slit. She saw Jacob standing in the front row, flanked by his attorney and two smug-faced council members who clearly thought this was some kind of political stunt. But Amanda had no interest in politics. When the moderator called her name, the room went quiet. She stepped into the light, heels clicking with a purpose. The projector screen behind her glowed as she placed a thick folder onto the podium and addressed the crowd. "I never thought I'd be standing here," she began, her voice steady. "But sometimes, silence becomes complicity, and I refuse to be complicit." There were murmurs. She clicked the remote. Slide 1, a scanned bank statement showing a suspicious transfer, $42,000 paid from the town's community development fund to a shell company. Slide 2, screenshots of internal emails, Jacob approving urgent maintenance contracts that never materialized. Slide 3, a photo of the empty plot where the new rec center was supposed to be. Gasps echoed. Jacob stood, interrupting. "This is slander. That money was accounted for." Amanda didn't flinch. "Then explain why that shell company is registered to your brother-in-law's address in Nevada." The crowd went silent again, like all the air had been sucked from the room. The moderator tried to keep order, but it was pointless. People were already pulling out their phones. Reporters scribbled. One councilwoman covered her mouth in disbelief. Amanda pressed on. "This isn't just financial misconduct. This is theft from the children who never got that rec center, from the seniors waiting for a transit van that never came, from families who trusted you." Jacob shouted, "This is a witch hunt. She's bitter because she lost everything in the fire." Amanda turned to him slowly. "You mean the fire you tried to pin on an electrical fault? The same fire your cousin, an unlicensed contractor you insisted on hiring to save budget, oversaw the final inspection for?" She turned back to the audience. "I found his falsified reports. They're in this folder. So are the texts he sent Jacob hours before the fire." The moderator stood, stunned. "We'll need to—" "No," Amanda said. "The town deserves to hear this now." Jacob, red-faced, lunged forward, only to be held back by two deputies who had quietly entered through the side. One of them placed a hand on his shoulder. "We've heard enough too, sir." Gasps gave way to murmurs. Murmurs became applause. Amanda stepped away from the podium. Her hands were still shaking, but not from fear. This time it was adrenaline. Years of grief, loss, injustice were now giving way to clarity. As Jacob was led out the back, one reporter turned to Amanda. "Why go through all this?" She looked at the crowd, at the faces watching her with new eyes. "Because my son died thinking his life didn't matter. I had to make sure he knew, even if it's too late, that someone fought for him." And with that, she walked out, not as a victim, but as a woman who reclaimed her story. The courtroom had cleared out, leaving only a few people behind, mostly reporters typing furiously, and Eleanor sitting still in the front row, staring straight ahead like the trial hadn't even ended. Her ex-husband, David, had just been convicted of insurance fraud, elder abuse, and obstruction of justice. But that wasn't the real victory. The real victory was something quieter, deeper. It was Eleanor finally reclaiming her place at the center of her own life. The judge's ruling had been stern and final. David would face 6 years in prison, followed by mandatory restitution to Eleanor and her son. More importantly, the forged documents he'd filed had been fully overturned. Eleanor's name was back on her father's home, her business license reinstated, and her reputation cleared. As she stepped out of the courthouse, Eleanor didn't say a word to the cameras. She didn't need to. The story had already been written, this time with the truth. But her healing didn't begin with the verdict. It began the moment she walked back into the old bookstore that afternoon. She hadn't been there since David had forced her to sell it. But now, with the court ruling in hand, she had full legal authority to reclaim what had been stolen. The locks were changed. The shelves were dusty. The sign had been taken down and replaced with a cheap insurance office banner. Eleanor stood at the doorway holding a new key in one hand and a crowbar in the other. She chose the crowbar first. It wasn't just a building. It was the space where she'd built her independence, her identity, and every page of her life after surviving her mother's early death. David had taken that from her, piece by piece. But she was done letting him rewrite her. Inside, she ripped down every trace of his renovation. Posters, signs, fake plants, gone. The bookshelf she'd built with her son when he was 9, still in the back room, covered in cobwebs. She wept when she saw it. Not out of sadness, but from the quiet triumph of knowing she'd gotten her hands back on something real. Rebuilding wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance, boundaries, taking the pieces of her life that David had twisted and making them whole again, but this time, stronger. When the media tried to spin her as the scorned ex-wife who outsmarted her husband, she politely corrected them. "I'm not an ex-anything. I'm a business owner, a mother, and I fought back because no one else was going to." She hired a new team, young women from the neighborhood who'd always dreamed of opening creative spaces. She gave them keys, ownership, and mentorship. The store became more than a business. It became a safe house for women who had been gaslighted, cheated, and silenced. Eleanor called it the rewrite. She didn't go back to her old self. She didn't want to. That version of her trusted David gave him too many chances and excused the unexcusable. This Eleanor, this one, had boundaries, had a spine, had a voice, and wasn't afraid to use it, even if it shook. She stood in the shop on its reopening day, watching customers filter in, smelling fresh coffee and old paper. Her son, now in college, was beside her, smiling with pride, holding up a copy of the book he'd published using funds from the restitution David had been forced to pay. It was titled When She Stopped Whispering. And Eleanor? She was done whispering too. The weeks after the confrontation blurred into a quiet storm of changes. Jessica didn't speak to her mother for 3 weeks. Not out of hatred, but necessity. For once, she needed space to breathe her own air, think her own thoughts. She spent time repainting the small guest room she had moved into temporarily. Soft blue, calming. She threw away old photographs, kept a few. She didn't cry over the losses anymore. Now, she chose what to mourn and what to release. One Sunday morning, as she sat on the porch sipping black coffee, her phone buzzed. A message from her cousin Emily. "She's been asking about you. She's quieter now." Jessica didn't reply, but she smiled faintly. She wasn't ready yet, but maybe someday. Her days took on a different rhythm. She joined a small writing group at the library, not to talk about revenge or trauma, but to write fiction. Stories that didn't always end in betrayal. She found herself drawn to characters who rose from ashes rather than stayed buried in them. She didn't know it then, but she was writing her own healing in between the lines. Occasionally, she'd see familiar faces from the courtroom, neighbors, extended family members who once doubted her. Some looked away, ashamed. Others approached her gently. One even whispered, "You were brave. We just didn't know the whole story." The bakery down the street started recognizing her order. "The usual?" they'd ask. A small smile. Yes, the usual. A sense of normalcy slowly stitched itself into the torn fabric of her days. And her father, well, that wound was different, deeper. She didn't forgive him. She didn't have to. But she stopped letting his silence define her worth. She no longer needed his love to measure her own strength. What surprised her most, perhaps, was what she felt toward her mother. Pity. Not in a condescending way, but in the way one might pity a bird that chose to stay in a cage with the door wide open. Her mother had trapped herself in illusions, in fears, in loyalty to a man who never deserved it. One evening, Jessica walked to the edge of the lake behind the old house. It was quiet, the water still. She skipped a stone, once, twice, 3 times, then watched it disappear. Letting go doesn't always feel triumphant, she realized. Sometimes it just feels still. Months later, she received a letter in the mail. No return address, but she recognized the handwriting. "I don't know how to fix this. I just hope you find peace. I never meant to choose him over you. I just didn't know how to stop him. Mom." Jessica folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply felt ready for the next chapter, for love maybe, for softness that didn't cost her dignity. And as the sun dipped below the trees and the shadows lengthened across the porch, Jessica leaned back in her chair, hands wrapped around a warm mug. The world hadn't changed, but she had, and sometimes that was enough.